So, you're live? Okay. All right, thanks everybody. I'm a little shocked at a full theater, so thanks for showing up. Like I said, this isn't the crypto talk. This is about how to work through lousy code bases. Is anybody working in a difficult code base at the moment? Are any of you working on code bases that I've worked on? Oh, crap. Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, I am Jim Holmes. I'm with Pillar Technology. I also have a side business, Guidepost Systems, but if you're looking to get a hold of me, Holmes at Pillar Technology will work just fine. I'm also on Twitter, Jim Holmes. I'm not the Jim Holmes. Also, I am not Jim Holmes. Jim Holmes lives in London. He writes C code. He's got this epic mustache, and he's really tired of getting test questions posted. For a while, he said, I put the bugs in, Jim Holmes gets them out. That was pretty funny. I blog at frazzledad.com. I also am in the middle of a book on Lean Pub, The Leadership Journey. So it's Lean Pub. You can go grab a free copy, or if you want to help support my Scotch habit, you can pay a few bucks. That's always appreciated. All of my slides are up on Speaker Deck. Note that Speaker Deck, not SlideShare. So this deck is up there. I've also got, there's no code involved in this talk, but if you're looking for any of my test automation or other things, you can find that on GitHub/Jim Holmes. Okay, so the premise of this talk is how to go about trying to heal a bad code base while you're still continuing to deliver value. Few of us have the luxury of working for organizations where you can just take a team off of their regular work and go off for 3 months, 6 months, or a year to actually just rebuild something from scratch. I'm not talking about building new stuff. I'm talking about, oh my God, this thing sucks. Let's just take time off and rebuild the whole thing. If you are in that position, that's amazing. You probably don't need this talk. So this talk's goal is to give you ideas to take back to your work. I don't do best practices. If you've heard that rant, I'll save. But to give you some ideas to go back and hopefully start a productive conversation about getting some time on the schedule to get things fixed up. So the funky little boxes down in the corner, I've got 4 major sections, and somebody pointed out once that they got confused about where they were in the slides. So the little sections there walk through kind of the 4 steps in this process that I came up with. And so as I was working on my slide deck, as I was driving over here this morning, I'm kidding, I wasn't working on the slide deck this morning. But I was kind of running back through things. I realized can we fix shouldn't be can we fix. Rather, it's should we fix. So the first step in this is taking an evaluation of whatever the problems we're having, should we go about fixing it, or should we live with them for any number of reasons? What do we want to fix? And this is in the broad sense. What are the themes? What are the epics? What are the business values that we're trying to address? From there, moving down to something a little more specific, like backlog, and then actually getting the work done. So each one of these sections here is going to have an outcome. And the first one is just an agreement or a consensus from the entire team that, yes, it makes sense to take a next step. So this is an idea of particularly targeted toward those of us in the engineering or delivery side, getting management, leadership, the people that write the checks, to agree that we've got to fix stuff. So the first thing is just laying a case out. Can we get some agreement about fixing things? The next thing is to make sure that we've got clear business goals. I'm going to hammer that home throughout this entire 3-hour session. Okay, you are all awake, good. So too often, we on the delivery side, the engineering side, don't think enough about business value. We don't think about goals, and we've got to change that. So we're going to talk about goals, we'll talk about epics, and we need to talk about a cost so that business can make some intelligent decisions. We'll talk about creating up backlog and then actually getting stuff working, because that's kind of the whole point, right? Working stuff. Again, it's not necessarily can we fix it, but should we fix it? Should we even try? And, you know, sometimes we get so fixated with the problems and the struggles that we're having that we may not understand some of the things that are going over on the business side. Maybe we're working on an old legacy system and it doesn't make sense to invest much effort because, you know, Cowbell version 2 is coming out, or the business is totally changing its direction and this area now is not as important, and instead we need to focus on new things. So sometimes it doesn't make sense to invest the effort for a large-scale fix. And that's something that we need to get our hands around and get our heads around. Sometimes it's okay for business to say, I get that it sucks, but we're not going to do anything about it now. The output of this stage is a consensus of, yeah, it makes sense, you've laid out a good case, let's go investigate some more stuff and see if it's a little more feasible. So again, business value. How many of you are on the business side of things? And I say that like you've got a foot in sales, you've got a foot in the finances versus being mostly focused in technical. How many of you have that kind of a role? Okay, so there's probably less than 10 hands that went up. So the rest of you, I'm going to do a broad stereotype and say that you are on the delivery side of things. Too often, we engineering or delivery types don't spend enough time thinking about business value. It's just the way it is. But I'd say that it's kind of an evolution of the maturity of your career is to get more in tune with what your role is to bringing your company value. And I say that because, you know, there's a lot of times where we will be stuck working with a crappy, brittle, scary code base, and it's like, God, I just want to burn this thing to the ground. Fair to say? Yeah, there's a lot of painful nods back there, except the one guy that's still stuck wanting to be in the crypto section. I'm going to get a lot of mileage out of that, all right? I get one thing that gets a couple laughs, and I just keep hammering on it. So we have to think about when we've got an idea and we're trying to bubble it up and make a case to business or management or whomever, if we can't tie it to business value, the odds of making that successful, slim and none. So first and foremost, as a team, we need to have a meeting to start getting this idea together. And when I talk team, particularly in the first parts of this, I mean the whole team. So I mean testers. Yes, we testers are part of your team, sorry. The developers, the PMs, the BAs. Who else is part of a team that's impacted by software? Users, support. Support's a big part of that team. How many of you have an active engagement with your support folks? Everybody in this room that has support for the system that they deliver should raise their hand. And I say that from a guy who's lived as support and has lived as somebody who has shipped crap that support has to take care of. Management and your stakeholders and your executive sponsors, the people that write the check. You want to get all of these folks into the same room or the same video conference for this initial discussion because you need support from all those folks and you need buy-off from all those buy-off from all those people. So as a group, we've got to evaluate where we're at. You have an idea that the system sucks, right? But what you need to understand as an entire group is it really as bad as everybody thinks it is? So this part is totally high level. You should not be opening Visual Studio, RubyMine. For those of you that are writing PHP, Notepad, or whatever it is, you build stuff in there. This is not about the code. all right? So here's some questions you might ask yourself. What do our ship cycles look like? What does it take for us to actually release software? So I'll tell you about a place that I worked at, and some of you may nod your heads, and some of you may slink down in your seats a little bit. But I went to work for a company once where we shipped software to major international enterprise organizations. These organizations were using this platform as, some of them were using it as their backbone for their intranet. Some of them were using it as their backbone for their customer-facing activities. Some of it were using this platform for hosting content to millions of technical people around the globe. When I got there, this place had no QA. I'm sorry, God, I hate QA. Who's testers in the room? How do you assure quality? It's a rhetorical question. All right, so there were no testers whatsoever, none. The typical release was usually about 4 months of development and about 2 months of hardening phase. How many of you have hardening phases in your release cycle? Hardening phases mean unicorns die and kittens get kicked. Because what are you doing during a hardening phase? Are you adding any new value? Are you building new features? No, you're fixing the crap you just wrote. So this hardening phase would start, and we'd go through this internal engineering test phase where we'd get the worst things, and then we'd get to a place where we thought we had RC, Release Candidate 1. So we'd roll Release Candidate 1 out to our corporate intranet where our entire company did all of its business on because we dog fooded our stuff. So we'd roll Release Candidate 1 out, and about 5 seconds later, the intranet would crater and go down, so we'd pull it back. We'd take about a week, and we'd fix whatever those major things were. We'd put RC2 out, the thing would crater, we'd go back, and we'd take about 3 days this time. Generally, about RC4 or RC5, we would get our first thing where we didn't bring down the release candidate. So I'm seeing some painful grins up there. But wait, there's more. So we'd get a more or less stable-ish release candidate on the internet, and then we would do that time-honored, most awesome use of everybody's time, the corporate bug bash. And if you're thinking I was sarcastic there, I was extraordinarily sarcastic. Unguided bug bashes are a waste of time. Because what are they usually measured on? Hey, who found the most bugs? How many here measure their productivity by lines of code? So number of bugs found is just about as stupid as measures lines of code. So finally, we'd get to the point 5 or 6 weeks later after a 4-month window of development time to where we had something that we felt it's the gold build, and we'd ship that. And 1 week or 2 weeks later, we'd ship a service pack. And that service pack was not to address a single issue that customers had found during that 2-week period. It was to fix the crap we knew we'd shipped. Does that sound familiar to anybody? So I'm seeing some very terrified heads shaking. No, I don't look like that. If your system looks anything like that, you need to get honest and that there's some fixes that need to happen. So it's not just long ship cycles. Automated tests, how many of you are doing some form of automated testing? That's awesome, great. So a lot of times I have worked for organizations, or as a consultant I go into places where there are few automated tests or less. That's a safety net, right? Automated tests don't prove the quality of anything, but what they do is give us some confidence about being able to fix things and modify things without breaking other areas, which is huge. If you've just got that safety net in place, that's a big deal. So I said QA here purposely because QA doesn't assure anything. But you know, a lot of times we have this mindset of, oh, I'm a developer, I'm done, I'm going to throw it over to QA. And they've got a day left in the iteration. You know, they can get through it, right? So it ends up being a little crazy. where QA is trying to keep up with stuff and it doesn't work. Or you're finding your developers are getting pretty whacked out. You know, sometimes you walk by the developer room and there are people up on whiteboards and they're having good conversations, or as it gets a little later in the release cycle, things are starting to look a little bit like this. So serious thing here, back to those folks who are in touch with your support, you know right away by the relationship you have with your support how things are going. Because when things are going well, you're welcome over in the support room. When things are not going well, you're lucky if you can make it in the building. Most important, the people who are paying you for your services. And this doesn't matter if it's external paying customers or internal paying customers or people who are using the frameworks that you're building, right? Everybody builds something for a user, for a customer. So that same company that I went to where we had the release cycle drama, we had 3 major customers whose names you would recognize, who, when I got there, had told the company, you can't use us as a reference customer. Okay, so anybody who has the remote idea of an impact of what it means to sales, when you can't use, something that is a organization that everybody would know of and saying, yeah, they use our software, when they say, no, you can't mention us, that is a huge, huge deal. And that's direct impact on sales, renewals, revenue. So if you've got problems in these areas, that group that you've got hopefully can come to some sort of a consensus, yea and verily, we've got to get stuff done. A lot of times this is not a one-day meeting, right? Magic doesn't happen. I am not pretending that you will manage to get everybody in place and come to this sort of an agreement right away. If you have managed to do that, awesome, because that means you have people that want to listen to what you're saying, and awesome because you've managed to message your ideas very well. But the thing is, all of those things tie directly to business value. How are we doing? What are the impacts to our bottom line because of this lousy system that we have? All right, so step 2, and the red box moves over. So we haven't talked at all yet about what we want to fix. It's just a simple acknowledgement of, yeah, we've got a big problem and we need to invest some time. So this section now, the idea is that we want to tie back to that first item right there, business goals. We want to identify some business goals that we want to improve the situation in. We're going to come up with some ideas about what we'll do that align with that. We're going to have to get some form of a cost or an estimate, and I'll rant on that in a little bit. In case you haven't figured, you're in for a lot of rants. All right, so business drives the goals. Business writes the checks, right? It's a weird thing, even those of us who have worked for product vendors or as consultants, a lot of times it might seem like we directly hit the bottom line, but it's the business that does that, right? So they need to set the strategy and the vision. That's not that, maybe we can't have some say in there, but we need to make sure that they're setting the goals. What does business care about? They care about lowering risk. So what kind of risk does business generally think about? So I always use the 3 broad generalizations. Are we losing revenue? Are we losing customers? So losing customers sort of ties to that, right? And are we going to get sued? That's 3 kind of common risk areas. Business also cares about increasing value. So dropping support costs, right? So we drop support costs, we're spending less money over here. It also results in happier customers. Sell more stuff, right? If we were losing renewals, for an example, we care about that. We want more people renewing, so we're selling more stuff. And Who here works for organizations where, like, every release they say, take as much time as you want? Wait a minute, no, I don't see any hands. Okay, how often do we hear we need to ship faster? Now, you may work in a reasonable organization where they're willing to talk about changing scope, right? But we are under pressure to ship faster and faster, and bad systems prevent that. So any tech change that we start to think of here needs to align with those business goals. So I'm going to carry a couple stories through the rest of this talk. So online retailer. Let's imagine that we've got some problems around security for account access. And it's not that we're exposing credit cards or anything needlessly, but we've had a lot of support issues around I'm not able to see certain areas of my system that I should. Another area that I'll talk about is directly tied to revenue, which is when you click checkout on your shopping cart, occasionally, more than occasionally, we're getting dropped transactions. So the checkout actually doesn't happen. We don't get money. That's bad. And then the third thing will be, like Amazon, maybe we've got a recommendation issue. Hey, I see you've got Marvel Avengers comic books in your shopping cart. Maybe you'd like a ticket to Star Trek to see Ultra. So we'll kind of go around those, right? So the idea here now is that we're looking for specific things that align to the business goals. Well, okay, we've got those three broad ones. So as we go through figuring out what to do in these areas, having some sense of, let's sort of rank stack the scale of the work that's needed so that we can get a rough idea of the level of effort. So you can use your own ideas here. You can use 2 boxes. You can use 4. I don't care. But come up with some categories, right? So a patch. Look, I know that for this, in this area, I think it's going to be a pretty simple fix. We need to change some exception handling around a couple things. It's not going to be a big deal. It's small change, right? Moreover, there's no impacts to other systems, right? Because how often do we developers think it's one line of code? And then your tester over here says, dude, that's one line of code that hits 4 external systems and 3 vendors. Has anybody ever heard that? I'm a dev and a tester. I've said that to myself. So repair is something that's a little bigger. You know, it's in between the two, surprisingly. Burn it to the ground is pretty self-explanatory. This part of the system is so screwed up and it is so convoluted, it makes no sense. We're just going to repave it totally. So repair is somewhere in the middle of there, right? It's a significant area, but it's not a rewrite. And the thing is, if you hold these categories as you move forward, that helps you get an idea of how long it's going to take you to fix stuff. So what's the current state? If we've started to figure the business goals are improve the customer checkout experience, so then we're going to focus on those 3 things I talked about. How many of you track bugs? Well, most everybody. So I always find it interesting to head to the bug tracking system as a first indicator, sort of the state of the state. What kind of significant bugs do you have open? What kind of significant bugs have you closed out? What's the overlap in those feature areas? Because now I can get an idea of the scale of what's going on in there. How many of you have bug tracking systems with open entries that are more than 6 months old? Keep your hands up. By the way, this is my hand because I've been there too. More than a year old. More than 3 years old. More than 5 years old. Why? If you haven't fixed it in 5 years, you're not going to fix it. Just admit it. All right, so what is the code base like? Now's the time when we start getting into specific areas of the code base, right? We've got our 3 areas, and it makes sense to start taking a look at what those parts of the code base are like. And the idea is to try to figure out if it's one of these. Anybody know Unicode? If it's a big pile of stinking poo. I thought that was going to get a better laugh. The internet's awesome. Somebody wanted a big pile of poo in Unicode. They have a lot more time than I do. So we want to take a look at the code base. Dependencies kill, right? So we want to get an idea for these three major areas that we're looking at. What external dependencies do we have? What dependencies do we have between classes, between modules? What does the cyclomatic complexity look like? If we have 35 nested ifs with about 8 case statements plugged in there, I wrote that stuff one time, by the way, that's going to be tough to fix. Size of classes, size of methods, churn, the number of times that we have hit a module or a class file in the source control system. This is one of the most interesting pieces of metric that you can get. So, you know, there's all kinds of little scripts for GitHub or SVN or whatever that can tell you churn, and that's the number of times that somebody's touched a file. So it's the number of times that you've changed and had to reach in there. So if you've got a crazy high churn on a class, it means that class is either really crappy and really brittle, or it is relied on by a crazy number of things, all of which are dangerous. So we start to look at dependencies, complexities, churn, all of these things, and there are a number of tools that can help you out. So if you're in the .NET world, there's things like ndepend, which if you haven't had a look at, oh my God, go grab the trial now. Not now, after this session. It will tell you crazy amounts of metrics around complexity, dependencies, all of this stuff. There's SonarQube, which is getting nearer and closer to Visual Studio. So there's a lot of good tools. If you're not on the .NET platform, SonarQube is cross-platform, works on a number of different places. Ruby has a metric crapload of tools. PHP does as well. Point being, go find tools that will help you gather these metrics. But again, you have to overlay the areas that line up with those business goals, right? So you can find all of this crazy stuff over here in some unrelated component, but you want to focus on these things that we've been talking about, right? The 3 areas. There may be 4 other areas that suck, but the business has decided these are the 3 areas to focus on over here. Oh, overlap, I just said that. Because that's where we want to focus and where we will get our time to be able to work. So now's the time. So I use epics here. I don't care what flavor of Agile, big A, small a, waterfall, CMMI. The point here is that we're not getting down yet necessarily to user stories. We're not getting down to small pieces. Rather, it's like rework exception handling around the checkout process. That's all that we want to get to, enough information to move on to the next step, because we don't want to dive too deep yet. The point now is that we've got an idea of the business goals that we want to work with and some of the tech debt or some of the mess that overlap that, right? Now we have to get business some ideas so they can make some prioritization. So diving down into user stories and diving down to tasks at this point is a waste of time. Estimates. Okay, estimates are tough, right? So first off, software, regardless of whether you call it construction or craftsmanship or anything, is difficult to get our hands around sometimes. Moreover, a lot of times there's a perception as we communicate information up that it's an estimate. They say, no, you said estimate, I heard exactimate. So we want to take that information, and if, again, I can't emphasize this enough, this is not a quick process, right? Especially if you've been in an environment where, as the delivery team, regardless of what management has done to you with reprioritization, if you have built a trust deficit, if you've dug a hole with missed release dates for whatever reason, now there's problems around estimates. Anybody in that situation? I've been in this all the time. And it's tough to get out of. So this takes some conversations around, look, we're talking broad. We just want you to tell us which of these 3 options you think might make sense. Okay, so we've gone through this exercise. We've figured out some broad business goals. We've figured out some areas that align with that. We've got our hands around the high-level pieces that we need to do, and we've got some rough scale of information that we can give back to the business owners on what it's going to take to do that. So the intermittent failures for the checkout process, we think that's a 3-week effort to fix and test reliably. The recommendation engine is probably about a month's worth of development effort plus 2 weeks of testing. And then the security piece is probably 4 weeks, both engine, right? So we give them broad ideas. It's not days, it's not hours, it's weeks, or even t-shirt sizing, right? If you're in an organization that's comfortable with small, medium, large, win. Otherwise, give the management something that's close, but have that conversation with the business owners so they are, and when I say business owners, I don't mean the person whose name is on the front of the building, but rather the stakeholders. So now we've got ideas where they can make choices. And that's exactly what we've tried to do. We started off getting approval, yes, we need to do something. Now we know what we need to do. Now it's time to talk about the specifics of what. How are we going to fix it? So now is the time when we get through this, we'll have stuff on the backlog, or whatever you call it, right? We'll have actionable items to move on through. So first off, we have to talk about culture. And here's now where things get tough, because especially if you are part of a team that has been responsible for getting you into this situation, there's some egos involved. Regardless of whether it was at the stakeholder, at the program manager, at the owner, at management who keeps redirecting, and as you, as the engineering team that wrote the stuff and didn't do as good a job of testing. Pride and ego were there. It's human nature. So you've got to be careful about that. What's the first step to getting out of a hole?
Stop digging.
Thank you. So here's the thing. As hard as it is, you have to get the whole team to just basically put that stuff behind you and agree, look, we have an opportunity here, and not a lot of folks get this opportunity. It is a rare chance that you're getting management and business support to change things. Stop digging, and that means backing each other up and calling each other out, holding each other accountable. Jim, you just put 8 if statements in there. I'm going to throw a chair at you. Don't. You have to hold each other accountable, and you have to hold yourselves accountable. And that also means when somebody calls you out, not getting that first reaction, which is, what the hell do you mean? Oh, yeah, I did put 8 ifs. I'm sorry. I'll back out the commit and the failed tests. Oh, tests. Yes, we should have tests because they give us that safety net. And if you're not doing automated testing already, learn how and start. Is anybody here doing any form of BDD-ish where you're development, where you're writing specifications or things? So there's a few hands raising up. That's awesome. For those of you that aren't, I'm not here to preach a particular tool set or methodology. I'd encourage you to read this book, Specification by Example, authored by Gojko Adzjic. Don't ask me to spell that, just Google this title. Yes, question? I think I've got, oh, I am low battery. Oh, well, see, I shouldn't have worked on my slide deck while I was on the way over here. Thank you for pointing that out. So specification by example, while I am plugging in power here, is a way to better improve the types of conversations you're having So BDD, ATDD, the magical development methodology of the day is not about the technical piece. It's about the conversations. As a matter of fact, if you're focusing on the technical stuff, I've never had a roadie before, thanks, man. I feel really cool. Thanks. Thank you for pointing that out.
First time for everything.
All right, so this is about getting better conversations. The automation is nice and shiny, especially if you're like doing UI testing, because things pop up and they happen and you can sit back and go, wow, this is awesome. So look into this kind of stuff. Point being, the conversations are the important part there. So as far as now, we're trying to figure out the exact things that we actually do have to get on the backlog. Anybody know Michael Feather's book, Working Effectively with Legacy Code? Those of you who haven't raised your hand, how many of you are working on legacy systems? Go buy this. I'll stop yelling at y'all, all right? I don't mean to be mean. This is an amazing book. It's now like, it's like 14 or 15 years old, and it totally doesn't matter because it's about approaches to working and making things more flexible, breaking dependencies. This is an amazing book. This was one of the most impactful books that I've read professionally in a long time. So grab that. Remember the things that we talked about. We're now writing backlog items. Reassess if you've got the right scale of things. You may start doing more in-depth analysis now, and you realize that, oh, we thought this was going to be a 3-week effort, and it turns out that it's going to be a 6-week effort because we just ran into this nasty component that we're reliant on. Has anybody ever run into that? Raise your hands. Okay, so how many of you are hesitant to go back to management at whatever level and say, we thought this was going to be a 3-week effort, it looks like it's going to be 6? Is that an easy conversation? No. That culture change that I talked about is crucial here. When you find these things, you have to communicate that as early as you know enough information to give an updated estimate and more information out. And people are going to be upset because they're trying to make decisions and they said, man, you know, we reprioritized everything so we could fit this 4-week effort in, and now you say that, you know, we thought it was going to be 3 weeks of dev and 1 week of testing, and now it's 6 weeks of dev. And the only thing that you can say at that point is, would you rather know now or when we were 3 weeks into that dev effort? A lot of times we've built a trust deficit. We've got to get out of that hole, right? But if you find these things out and you communicate them early and you say, we didn't understand that, it's the nature of the beast. If they're still pushing back, you can like open up Visual Studio and start walking that stakeholder through the lines of code. I'm sure they'll love that. But as you're building those things up, constantly reassess. Do we have the right knowledge about this? Does it look like it's the right time? And if not, communicate that early. So, correctness, performance, and readability. 3 critical factors to how the code base looks. So as a mental exercise, you don't have to shout them out, but think about how you prioritize those. And I'll tell you my opinion, and if your opinion doesn't match mine, that's okay, you're wrong, but that's all right. So optimization or performance should always be the last thing we do. Is anybody here working for NASA? Okay, so we have no rocket scientists who are like writing space shuttle control code. So most people don't have to quite worry about optimization. Correctness. Have any of you ever seen like the confusing C snippets that sometimes run around? Like people will try to make the most obfuscated C code that they possibly can. Nobody's seen those? Seriously? I got a couple hands going up. Okay, so the point is purposely making code hard to read so you can't understand what it does. But you know it's correct. Well, if there's a bug in that code and you can't read it, how are you going to know where the heck the bug was? As you're looking at this stuff, with a mind of you're trying to heal up the code base, To me, readability is one of the biggest things you can work on. Even if it's just extracting methods out of, you've got a 300-line method or a 3,000-line method. Don't hide. You've seen those, or I've written them. That's something that is going to help you over time. Getting rid of complexity. So pulling out some of those nasty if blocks. Pulling out mixed responsibilities. Did I have cut dependencies in there twice? Maybe I did, but it's that important. I should have it in there twice. Okay, work as small as possible. We hear that all the time. Depending on who you listen to in Agile, you should have work items that are no longer than half a day, no longer than 1 day. Well, if you're working in legacy code, sometimes that 1 day long work item is like 2.5 weeks because it is such a wrapped up thing. It happens, but make the work as small as possible so you get that fast feedback and keep people advised. I had once a 3-day feature. So I joined a new consulting company. I was really excited about it because I was working with pals from the community. And I got this work item, and it said, make this thing work like the other thing. It's a little more technical than that, but effectively it was that. So I go to look at the specs because I'm looking for some more information. And the specs down there said, make this thing work like the other thing. That one 3-day card took me 3 months. But what I did is I found all of these new features that needed to be added. I tore them out as separate work items. If you track the work as small as possible and you break that down, you'll find when you're going off track much more quickly. Here we are. We've got backlog items built up. So now we're ready to move on to the cool part, because up to now, this has been like tense negotiation, tense discovery, having to look at the bad code that you wrote or were part of. Now it's time to start actually fixing, which is the cool thing. Working stuff, we're going to make stuff work, or maybe we're going to make it work better. So the first thing we have to talk about is culture. We have to have each other backed up and do stop digging. The second thing we have to talk about is culture. Because when you start to fall off and go back to the old ways, and you notice I said when, I didn't say if. How quickly does culture change happen? Culture change does not happen to where we can just talk about it 2 times. We've got to mention it a bunch of times because you have to have the expectation that everybody is going to hold each other accountable, and you're going to prevent yourself from getting too far back onto those bad ways. And that's not just the testers, it's not just the developers, it's the BAs, it's the product owners who push for those earlier ship dates. Look, can you just leave off testing this time? No, we can't. You remember the discussion we had? Can we add more scope on to this release? If you want to talk, we're push out the release date, and you feel this is the business, sure, yes, we can. No, I want you to keep the same release date. It's not how it works. We had this big conversation. Remember, we went through this exercise. If you feel piece C is more important, that's awesome, that's fine. But what from the backlog do you want to release? Do you want to get rid of? And the first time we'll say nothing, and you say, no, that doesn't work. You want something new, we take something else off. These are not easy conversations to have, right? You got yourself to this point because nobody would stand up for these kinds of conversations. And this is not going to magically fix the first iteration or get fixed the first iteration or the first release. This is a long-term effort, and that's one of those expectations that the entire organization needs to have. Honest collaboration. Honest collaboration is, holy crap, this thing we estimated at 3 weeks is going to take 6 weeks. Honest collaboration is taking that piece of information, even if you were the person that was involved writing the code that made it turn into 6 weeks, and boy, that's uncomfortable, right? I've been that guy. I hate mics. I've been that guy. It's like, oh my God, I did this. But if you get that open and honest and quickly, I'm not saying that pain and uncomfortable bit goes away, but over time, when you bring those up, you're actually building more trust. Has anybody here read a book called The Trusted Advisor? Very few. Seriously, only one in the back. Okay, so this is a book about, as a consultant, becoming someone that your client totally trusts and is open to you telling them no, and is open to you giving them uncomfortable advice. And actually not just open, but expecting you to do that. I'd encourage you guys to go find a copy of that and read it. It is targeted a little bit more toward consulting, but the overall mindset of how, as a team member, how can we as a team get to that place where bad news is not happily accepted, but willingly accepted? It's two different things, right? Yes, the book title was The Trusted Advisor. It's a great book. And again, it is not just about consultants. There's all kinds of good information there for you as a worker, regardless of your role. So you've built new patterns, right? We've had these conversations about, okay, look, we're not going to use static calls when we new things up. Jim, you can't write those 8 new ifs. Following these new patterns is the entire team backing everybody up to get the work done in a maintainable, flexible, craftsman-like method. Now, regardless of what you think of the software craftsman movement, the ideas of it are really solid, right? Let's write good stuff that we're proud to hand off that won't kill us when we have to come back to it in a couple months or the day after tomorrow. Pair programming freaks a lot of people out. It's like, oh my God, I've got to put up with their stinky onion breath. They got to put up with my stinky garlic breath. We're going to be chained at the same desk for 8 hours. That's not necessarily what pairing is about. You don't have to commit to 8 hours a day of pair programming. Pair programming is freaking exhausting. Regardless of whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, it is just challenging because for those of you who aren't conference speakers or who haven't spoken in front of a bunch of folks, there's a reason that I don't live code anymore because I suck worse than I usually do when people are watching me type. And now I'm going to have somebody 6 inches away from me doing that, right? So you have to get over all of this mental border, mental FUD about pairing. Pairing is an awesome way to work on changing that culture. And even if it is just, we're going to put a big visible chart, a part of the whiteboard or one of those big ass sticky notes up on the board, and we're going to put everybody's name down the x-axis and everybody's name across on the y-axis. Wait a minute, x up, y, I don't know. Put everybody's name on the 2 axes. And you just put a check mark. I've paired up with everybody at least once during this 2-week iteration. How long did you pair up? What'd you do? Don't know. I just paired up with them. We sat down and we solved the problem. We got something useful done. That can be a 5-minute conversation. It could be you two spending an entire day together, ripping something apart and building it back together again. And oh, by the way, pairing isn't just for devs. Testers should be sitting down next to devs. Ooh, that's scary, right? Because you can be talking test criteria. The testers can be learning more about the architecture. The devs can be learning of why just writing one happy path test isn't quite good enough. Testers can pair up with BAs. Devs should be pairing up with the product owner to make sure they understand what's going on. But getting the entire team talking more is one of the best things you can do to help change that culture and hold people accountable. Code reviews. Let's get everybody in the same room once a month and we will throw darts and rip code apart because you used the wrong casing here and you're an idiot because you spelled that variable wrong and Over here, you wrote a sort method, and your test for that instantiates a bunch of objects and then sorts and then counts on the number of items in the list. What? By the way, that was me. I wrote that actually once. I was sober at the time. Like 3 months later, I came back and I'm looking at this test because something in my sort was broken. I'm like, it can't be broken. I wrote a test around that. So I call open the test. New objects, load up an array, sort the thing. Count the items? Code reviews and pairing are helpful for that kind of stuff, but reviews can't be this antagonistic thing, and that's toxic. So, how many of you in the room are testers? I feel so alone with you guys. Okay, so for those of you that aren't testing, testing is actually useful, and if you do anything, it doesn't matter if you're a dev or a product owner or a support person, you have a role in testing. Who here likes branching? Y'all are weird. It's really, really weird. So I've worked for product companies, I've worked for consulting companies, I've worked for myself. I don't know branching well, but I know that it is critical for not an organization, for a team working on one thing to figure out a useful product branching strategy. So whether it's branch by feature, or whether it's branch by release, or branch by something else, work with your team and figure out what that strategy is, but don't approach it from, we're using Git, so we're going to do it this way. You're doing it wrong. Instead, think of the business problems that you as a team are trying to solve. Like, we're having problems making sure that we're getting our fixes promoted properly. How do you solve that? That's not a Git thing, that's a workflow thing. Spend time figuring this out, prototype it, and do that early. Because this, like your build and delivery chain, is one of your most important features. And if you get this right, this will help you when you go to do one of those scary parts where you've got a nasty component that has 9 billion dependencies going into it, and you've got to go off and spike this for a week to try to get this thing ripped out. And if you don't have a good branching strategy in place for that, which by the way is not floppy disks, all you're doing is going to inject more and more pain back in. If you need help with branching, feel free to drop me an email, and I will find somebody that knows branching, because that is not me. So, metrics. You remember the thing about estimates, that same evil crowd? That same evil crowd should be with metrics. Metrics are badly, badly, badly misused. Right now I'm working in Dearborn, Michigan with a global company that has hundreds of thousands of people around the globe building big things. Fill in the blanks, I'm under NDA. Their center of excellence for quality, their center of excellence for quality measures tester performance by bug counts. I'm really sorry too. I'm fixing it. I'm helping fix it because we changed things to where, like, our testers and the developers, if the testers find a bug, the developers just fix it. They don't log a defect. Yeah, that's quiet. That's that same quiet. That's what I got when I tried proposing that up the chain, because people were like, well, how's that going to work? It just works. Point being, some metrics are toxic at the organizational level because they encourage bad behavior. Those same metrics, if you're isolating it to a team, can be extremely useful. Velocity. How many of you measure performance by velocity? Team A had this velocity. You guys suck. You had half of it. Velocity is one of those evil metrics because it's not the same from team to team, right? Monitor the same metrics for your team, carefully choose them, and be very cautious about what you let out from your team that's doing this work. But as you're making movements through this effort, monitoring things like how are we doing with cyclomatic complexity? How are we doing with dependency count? How are we doing with cycle time on our delivery? That's a really interesting one to watch at your own team. Because if over like a 6-month time, if you're starting to get everything sized nearly the same, and you see that it used to take us 2 weeks to get a work item through, and now we're taking 14 days. No, not 14 days. Now we're taking 8 days. We've seen a good improvement. But that may not make sense for other teams. But monitor those same metrics over time. How's your culture doing? Everything about software development falls back to culture. Hard news if you haven't figured this out already, technology is not the hard part about shipping good software. Sorry, it just isn't. It's the culture. We've gotten to our last box here. We have had probably far too many late nights with tense discussions. There may have been nasty emails that you wish you could hit unsend. Yeah, that's me, sorry. You've had technological struggles, you've had struggles with your team, you've had struggles with your culture. Maybe you had to invite some people on your team to find another place to work because things weren't productive there. And I don't mean that in a mean fashion, right? Like, pooh, get out. It's just sometimes good people don't fit in the same team. But now it's time for working stuff. So hopefully at this point, and by the way, hopefully when you like push that last button, it's like, oh man, we've done this for 6 months and this is the first good thing we've seen. Hopefully that's not the case. This is released Creative Commons, do with it what you will. It's not magic, right? This is just some way that I went through in my head trying to solve this same type of problem at product companies I've worked at consulting engagements I've worked at. It's not magic. It's not guaranteed to work. I've had some epic failures with this. I've had some tremendous successes. So that one company that I talked about, when I left there, you remember when I started, we'd have like the 12 to 15 release candidates, right? We'd have a service pack 2 weeks after that release went out the door, and it was to fix crap we shipped. When I left there, we were down to like release candidates that were not only in the single digits, but were like under 5. We had shortened our hardening cycle. I couldn't eliminate it, but we shortened it from 5 or 6 weeks down to about a week. We had automated tests in place. We had discussions. Those 3 customers that I talked about not allowing us to use them as reference candidates, they were back being we could use them as references. And this is serious. My alcohol consumption was way down. I'll joke a lot about scotch consumption, but there was one release where at one point I looked at the recycle bin and it was like, holy shit. I went dry for 3 months because I was worried about where I was putting myself. This didn't magically save my life, it didn't magically save my marriage, but what I was able to do as part of a team, this was not me alone, part of a team, we got to the end here, and we were at a place where we had happy customers. Support actually didn't throw crap at me when I walked in the door. And we had happier engineering teams and happier sales folks. It's not magic, it takes work. You will fail along the way of doing this, but if you prepare yourself for that with fast feedback cycles and honest conversations, then you can knock it out of the park. Thank you very much. So I've got a couple minutes as folks are maybe pulling some food down. I'm happy to answer some questions. Remember, you're staying put for food.
Okay. Hey, real quick, if you are getting up, go out that side. So if you're facing the stage, go to the right, because we're going to bring stuff in from the left. And if you don't have a seat, you probably aren't going to, well, you might be first in line, but we don't necessarily have enough food for everyone, including the people that were standing room only. So right next door is a theater that has food. Right across the hall is a theater that has food. I encourage a few of you to mosey that way and help us kind of spread out the load. Thank you.
And I'll just be down here if you want to come down and chat about anything. But thank you again, everybody.